about the very latest discoveries as this terrible disease, mad cow disease, spreads across the United States under the media's radar, but not under our radar. You listen up carefully because you need this information very badly. Before we go to that, I've got Jim Marrs with me. Jim Marrs is going to be joining us on Dreamland on a regular basis. He's going to be a co-host like William Henry, specializing in conspiracies like William specializes in the lost past. It's going to be very exciting to have Jim with us on a regular basis. Jim is going to be talking today about Peter Jennings. Jim, tell us a little bit about what you've been thinking.
Hey, Whitley, it's always good to be with you. I'm wondering if we need to add Peter Jennings to the long list of UFO investigators who have all seemed to pass away due to cancer.
We have Don Ledger, we have Kenny Young, we have Bill Mallow, we have Jim Fueling, we have Congressman Stephen Schiff. All died of cancers, many of them quite unusual, like Bill Mallow's and Steve Schiff's. And now we have this tragic news right after he announces on the Larry King show that he believes there's something in the UFO issue. He is diagnosed with lung cancer.
Exactly. And, of course, even in the 2-hour special, Seeing is Believing, that ABC aired, and I'm sure he was very much constrained in what he could say. But yet, even in that special, we heard him ended up by saying this is one of the most fascinating investigations he had ever undertaken. So I think he was obviously impressed with the information that he was finding from his researchers in regard to the UFO issue.
Jim, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you know about cancer-inducing drugs as an assassination tool?
There is evidence to show that elements within the intelligence community of the federal government have been working very actively since the 50s, probably trying to see if they could come up with a cancer-causing agent. And I'm going to have some information that I'll present to the listeners on Dreamland that shows they may have been very successful with this. And if that's the case, then we have to go back and look at prominent people and people that were very in the forefront of some of the most sensitive investigations in this country who just suddenly die from cancer. I give you one good example is the nightclub owner, Jack Ruby, who, of course, was the man who shot Lee Harvey Oswald and prevented him from telling whatever he knew about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. In the summer of 1966, Jack Ruby was granted a new trial. Appellate judges said that he had there had been just too much publicity and in Dallas, and that he was granted a new trial. They were going to move it to Wichita Falls, Texas. But before that could happen, he was given a physical by the Dallas jail doctor and pronounced fit, okay, by the end of the summer of 1966. But then by Thanksgiving of 1966, they said he had entered Parkland Hospital with the flu. A few days later, they said, no, it wasn't the flu. It was lung cancer. And within 2 months, he was dead. Now, this is galloping cancer, and this is not very usual. And I think that it points us in the direction of purposeful death.
Yes.
By injecting cancer.
Well, you know, Congressman Schiff died of a relatively harmless form of cancer, skin cancer, that became extremely virulent in his case and perplexed and terrified doctors and ultimately took his life. Bill Mallow was given a physical and pronounced completely fine just a couple of weeks before he ended up with 2 different forms of leukemia.
That's pretty amazing. And let's look at what Congressman Schiff was involved in at the time that he suddenly got this terrible cancer. He was involved in a congressional investigation through the General Accounting Office of the Roswell crash of 1947. And although he was not able to get to any damning information, he nevertheless, in the GAO, reported that all of the message traffic between Roswell Army Airfield between the years of about 1946 to about 1949 were all missing. which should tell any thinking person that they had something to hide there, and it certainly must have gone far beyond just one of their mogul balloons. The argument, and they even made this argument on the Peter Jennings special, which was that Roswell was nothing unearthly. It was just a mogul balloon, and yet and they brought out Carl Flock as their expert, never mentioning that Carl Flock was former CIA and was also an assistant Secretary of Defense. So, obviously he has a vested interest in how he presents the Roswell story. But nevertheless, in his book, when he gives us the details of this classified mogul project, there were about 22 mogul balloon launches, and they only recovered less than 10 of them.
Yes.
And the reason they only recovered less than 10 is the simple fact, as Carl Flock reports, that they did not bother to go look for them. Now, that doesn't sound like much of a secret program to me.
No. Well, in my bottom line on Roswell is always very simple. My uncle, Colonel Edward Strieber, told me to my face that he had personally participated in the attempt to reassemble the debris from Roswell that had been brought to Wright Field. His commanding officer, General Arthur Exon, said to me, and I quote, "Everyone from the White House on down knew that it was not of this world within 24 hours of our finding it." So,
that's true. In fact, looking at the Roswell case, on balance, we find that on the one hand, if you want to trust the government, which has changed its story 4 times, then nothing much happened, although there's little or nothing to support that pronouncement.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there are now, as I counted, more than 400 individuals on the public record who have said, well, I was there, and gave stories similar to General Exon.
Jim, thank you very much. And, I've had my differences with Peter Jennings, but folks, do pray for him. This is an awful thing that has happened to this man. And whether it is something induced or just an unfortunate accident of nature, we probably will never know. In any case, stay tuned, because we're going to go looking into prion disease, and you really need to hear this. Both Colm Kellerher and then later Linda have got a lot to say about it. You need to understand this, and you need to understand it right now. Subscribers, this is to let you know that you can get $1 off on Brain Trust. There is a coupon available for you in the subscriber section. It is Brain Sub, that is BRAINSUB. If you input that as you check out of the unknowncountry.com store, you will get a nice $1 off on your purchase of Brain Trust. I'm honored to have with me today Colm Kellerher, former director of the National Institute for Discovery Scientists. Dr. Kellerher has written an incredibly important book called Brain Trust: The Hidden Connection Between Mad Cow and Misdiagnosed Alzheimer's Disease. I will start off this interview with a simple statistic from his book. In 1979, 635 people died from Alzheimer's disease in the United States of America. In 2002, 58,000 people died from this disease in the United States of America. This has been dismissed as simply changes in reporting methods and so on and so forth. Well, I don't think Dr. Kellerher would agree with that, would you, Colm?
No, I would definitely not agree. I would agree that there's a component of the expansion of the definition of what Alzheimer's really is between 1979 and here, but here we have a 9,000% increase in the numbers of deaths from Alzheimer's disease. And what really struck me a couple of years ago was a study by a group of people at Yale University and another from the University of Pittsburgh, where they went into the autopsied brains of Alzheimer's disease patients and showed that those patients had not died from Alzheimer's disease, but had died from a brain wasting disease that is linked with mad cow disease. And that was so hidden in the statistic of the 4 to 5 million people in this country with Alzheimer's. is a subset of unknown proportions that are dying from the human equivalent of mad cow disease. And that really was the impetus. It was both the increase in Alzheimer's disease as well as this hidden fraction dying from this strange disease that really caught my attention and prompted me to start writing this book.
Okay, now let's sort of go back to the beginning of the story. First, it's a fascinating and terrible story. And one, by the way, folks, you need to listen to this closely. Don't tune this out. This program was among the very first to feature Dave Louthan, by the way, who is an important whistleblower in this industry. Dave was pointing out that a cow that he had slaughtered that had proved positive for BSE, bovine spongiform encephalitis, was not what the Agriculture Department was claiming, a downer cow, that this animal was not downer, and that he had suspicions about its condition, which is why he had the brain matter tested. Dave subsequently lost his job, and we will be talking also about the unhealthy and unholy connection between the cattleman's industry, the ranching industry, and the Department of Agriculture, both here and in the United Kingdom, that has almost certainly led to the spread of this disease. In any case, let's go back and let's find out first, what is this disease and where does it come from exactly?
It is a truly unique disease biochemically and medically. It really came to the forefront of attention in a very obscure place in Papua New Guinea in the 1950s, when a medical researcher named Dr. Carlton Gajushek began investigating this tribe called the Foray tribe that were dying in their hundreds and actually eventually in their thousands from this unknown brain wasting disease that took them over. They began initially with symptoms of forgetfulness, and then tremors began, and then their entire bodies basically broke down. Dr. Gajushek was a very well-connected researcher, and he began autopsying these unfortunate tribespeople, sending their brains back to Washington, D.C., where it was discovered that the brains were actually shot full of holes like Swiss cheese. Plaques had started forming in the brains. And to make a long story short, it turned out that this disease, this terrible disease, was spread by means of cannibalism. The Foray tribe had the custom of eating their dead relatives, and many of these relatives had died of what the Foray called kuru, but actually, as many decades of research showed, was actually the human form of mad cow disease, which everybody knows. So this disease is not known to be a standard infectious entity like a virus or a bacterium. Instead, it is a remarkably small protein that changes shape from the normal shape in the cell and becomes pathological once it changes shape. It has a completely different biological function once it changes shape. And that is unique in the annals of molecular biology and biochemistry, and it's also one of the reasons why so much attention has been paid, because these diseases occur in cattle, in sheep, in animals, and in humans, and they have no cure. They progress over periods of years and even decades from the initial infection, which means they're incredibly difficult to track and impossible at this time to cure.
So it could be a time bomb going off in our midst. That's
absolutely correct.
Now,
the Australian authorities stepped in the 1960s, and especially in the 1970s, early 1970s, and outlawed cannibalism in Papua New Guinea. And
did they outlaw?
Even 30
I hate
years
to bring this up, but did they also outlaw the eating of corpses?
They did outlaw the eating of corpses, and
I know that was a feature of life in some tribes there.
Right. But even 30 years later, people were still coming down with this disease. In other words, people who had eaten corpses 20 years ago, or even 30 years ago, were still dying of this terrible brain-wasting disease. So we're not talking about the usual infectious disease that takes months, maybe, or weeks from initial infection to symptoms. We're looking at years, sometimes even decades.
No.
And that has obvious ramifications. For example, across in the United Kingdom, what really brought this whole thing to public attention was the infection and death of hundreds of thousands of cows from mad cow disease. And then subsequently in the 1990s, the mid-1990s, the beginnings of death of young people. It's now running at about 160 young people who have died from eating infected mad cow beef.
Now,
and
but let's Colm, let's talk a little bit about a certain process. That is to say, how this problem came to the attention of the British public, because it's very important to us Americans. It was the press, not the Ministry of Agriculture. The Ministry of Agriculture did everything possible, in fact, did it not, to hide the problem.
That's absolutely right. It was both the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Agriculture who persistently downplayed any possibility that the British public could be in any danger from eating mad cow infected beef. And in fact, as you rightly say, it was the media and the press who really drove the sense of alarm. And by the time 10 young people had died in Northern Ireland and in the United Kingdom from eating mad cow infected beef, finally, because of the crescendo of alarm being drummed up by the media, the British government finally, after years of stonewalling, finally admitted the truth that, in fact, eating mad cows was lethal. And it was only because of the persistent drumbeat from the media that really drove them. There was bureaucratic stonewalling between the late 1980s, when they first discovered that cows were dropping because of this disease, all the way into 1993. So that's 5 years of stonewalling.
During which the disease spread.
Oh, it spread incredibly quickly. It began in the late 1980s, as I mentioned, with only a few cows dropping from mad cow disease. By the mid-1990s, we're really talking about hundreds of thousands, between 100,000 and 200,000 cows had died of mad cow disease in the United Kingdom. And the British public were happily eating hamburgers. They were eating tripe, which is part of the stomach lining of the cow.
Yeah, boy, that really turned my stomach.
Of meat pies, which is pretty low-grade meat, and they were being encouraged to do so by TV programs from the Ministry of Agriculture, from the Ministry of Health, until finally the evidence was so strong that they could no longer deny it. But people had died before the government acted.
But more importantly, people are dying now and are going to die, as you say, for many years to come because of the government's inaction. And the thing that's so strange is that you would think that an industry that was in trouble like this would not want to hide it and conceal it and let the disease spread and therefore give itself more trouble and more expense in the long run, that the industry's first goal should be to actively seek to eradicate this instead of pretending it doesn't exist. But that was not true in the UK, and it's not true, as we'll see later, in this country, in what will be the most terrifying part of this interview to Americans. We're going to discuss other countries around the world too, but in just a moment, we're going to get back to this in just a couple of minutes with Dr. Colm Kellerher. His book, Brain Trust, The Hidden Connection Between Mad Cow and Misdiagnosed Alzheimer's Disease. And by the way, if you're a subscriber to UnknownCountry.com, you can listen to both of our Dave Louthan interviews from, I guess, February of 2004 on Dreamland and our special subscriber interview. And I urge you, if you are listening to this and thinking about this, also listen to Dave's interviews. They were the first interviews that he gave publicly, and they're very, very extraordinary, powerful interviews. He said things in those interviews that he never said anywhere else to my knowledge. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking to Colm Kellerher, author of Brain Trust, the hidden connection between mad cow and misdiagnosed Alzheimer's disease. Of course, Colm was also the director of NIDS, the famous National Institute for Discovery Science. And one of these days, Colm will come on the air and we'll talk about his work at NIDS. He's obviously gone on to different things now that NIDS is no longer an operational institution. And is what area are you working in now, if I may ask, Colm?
I'm working in the biotechnology sector, looking at the molecular biology of viruses, infectious disease, interrupting the virus life cycle using novel methods, and also looking at some of the chronic diseases, including cancer.
Okay, so you're certainly in another highly productive area of science, that's for sure. And you've written what I regard as one of the most important books that's come out, certainly in 2005, and probably at least in the last full calendar year, because this really lays it on the line about what is going on. And I want to ask you some very basic questions that aren't directly related to the book, but I know you have the answers. First, number one question: should we eat beef in the United States? And if so, is there one cut that's safer than another, or should we just stay away from it? And what about other meats?
One of the things that I have been doing since I first stumbled on this several years ago is I still occasionally eat beef, but what I like to do is to go to the organic stores and stay away from any of the beef that is anywhere close to the spine, for example, T-bones, etc. But I do quiz the people behind the counter about the origin of where those cows come from. And grain-fed animals, grass-fed animals that are outside the main sort of industrial chain, so to speak, they're the kind of animals that I go for. I mean, I was born in Ireland. I was raised on meat and potatoes, and I am reluctant to totally walk away from eating meat. But the very few times that I do eat beef, it is organic, grass-fed, grain-fed, and you can find out a lot of fairly good information by quizzing the people behind the counter or quizzing the manager.
Now, what about, I have to ask, everybody probably listening to this is within striking distance of a Whole Foods. Whole Foods sells New Zealand beef. Is New Zealand beef safe?
There's absolutely no indication that I've ever seen that mad cow disease has struck New Zealand at all. In other words, not even a ripple. So I would say New Zealand beef is safe.
New Zealand,
however, with the caveat that the cattle industry in the United Kingdom were extremely protective of the beef industry. The cattle industry in the United States are bending over backwards to downplay, and have been very successful at that. Downplay the absolute safety or the danger involved in eating beef, and they've done that through a superb public relations campaign. Now, are other countries doing the same thing? Yes, of course they are. So I would insert that caveat into the beef coming from any country. It is not in the national economic interest of any country to declare that they have BSE in their food chain, because it has devastating economic impacts on the industry.
And it's not even for the farmers, like the family in Canada. Tell what happened. It's one BSE cow was found in Canada, and in Alberta. Tell a little bit about what then occurred to that family and to the Alberta economy.
Well, that was in May of 2003, and as you know, only in the last several weeks, 2 more cases have come out of Canada, both of which have came out of Alberta. But in May 2003, the first case that you're speaking of, the family had actually they'd come from Louisiana, and they had started a new life in rural Alberta. They had purchased a series of animals, and then this first case erupted. The agricultural authorities came in. They confiscated all of their animals, and because of that single case in May 2003, the entire Alberta beef industry ground to a halt. The United States closed the border. There was no longer any export of either live cattle or processed meat from Alberta or from Canada into the United States. In other words, over that small period of time, a couple of $2 billion was lost. The family was subjected to a lot of harassment because of actually admitting this. And in fact, the then Premier of Alberta, who was Ralph Klein, threw out an off-cuff remark basically saying that the family should have shot the animal, shoveled the remains into the ground and just shut up about it. And he was vilified subsequently for that offhand remark. But that was the sense of outrage in the cattle industry in Alberta, that these people had actually come forward and admitted to having a diseased animal, and it cost the Canadian economy a couple of $2 billion. Now, subsequent to that, I personally interviewed a couple of ranchers up in Alberta, and they assured me that they would never, ever report any of their animals getting sick to the Canadian authorities for that very reason. They did not want the Canadian authorities to come in, confiscate their animals, and basically torpedo their livelihood.
So basically what you're saying is now the ranchers of Canada, when they see a BSE infected cow, are simply going to shoot it and make it disappear.
That's what the ranchers, both of them, told me, and they were absolutely unequivocal that they were not going to go through the horrendous trauma of losing their livelihood. So yes, it is a very, very short-term sort of narrow-minded viewpoint. It ignores the public health ramifications of mad cow disease, but that is what the ranchers told me.
Now, what happens when there are 2 diseases, variant Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease and I guess regular Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease that are caused in the human brain by prions. Some of these prions can be prions that were contracted or absorbed into the body by eating of beef. And we all know that cooking it doesn't help, that it can be cooked through and it still will. In fact, these prions are so hardy that they can even be immersed in formaldehyde and survive. In any case, are both of these CJD diseases implicated in the mad cow problem, or is it just one of them?
Currently, the scientific literature as well as the government responses have been completely unambiguous in saying that variant CJD is the only form of CJD that is directly associated with eating beef. However, there are some major exceptions to that rule, and it's mostly coming from the scientific research that's coming out of the United Kingdom, who are incidentally way ahead of the game in terms of research than a lot of the United States researchers, and there are exceptions, obviously. But what the United Kingdom researchers have recently found is that there are forms of BSE that actually look like sporadic CJD as well as variant CJD. Now, that is important for the United States for this simple reason. There has been no documented cases of variant CJD in the United States so far, except a single woman in Florida who died, who had been visiting the United Kingdom and who is assumed to have eaten United Kingdom tainted beef. So the only people so far in the public record in the United States who have died from CJD, and there are thousands who have died from the sporadic form of CJD. Now, why is that important? It is the sporadic form of CJD which is hidden in the epidemic of Alzheimer's disease. It has not been properly recognized because it is not a mandatory reportable disease in probably about half of the states in the United States. So nobody really knows what the numbers of people dying of sporadic CJD are in the United States. Now, sporadic CJD has been tied scientifically, and it is not definitive, but it is tied through the use of transgenic mice and other laboratory experiments to be, I would say, indirectly linked with BSC. BSC can, in some occasions, give rise to what looks like sporadic CJD in these experiments. The implications of that are pretty devastating for the United States, because the Center of Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, the United States Department of Agriculture have insisted to the American people that sporadic CJD has nothing whatever to do with eating beef. The science is beginning to say otherwise.
When we get back, we're going to be talking about one of the reasons why prions might have ended up getting into the animal population in the United States that involves a place called Patuxent. And we're going to, later in the program, talk about a rivetingly fascinating connection that Colm has drawn between, guess what, cattle mutilations and this disease. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back talking to Colm Kellerher. His book, Brain Trust, the hidden connection between mad cow and misdiagnosed Alzheimer's disease. My recommendation to you is simple. Get this book, keep it in your household, make your family read it, get it from us. That would be lovely. Get it from Colm's website, colmkellerher.com. Get it from Amazon. Get it from the bookstore. But get it. If this book is not on your bookshelf, you're making a mistake that has to do with the safety and welfare of all whom you love. I say that from the heart. Colm, let's now talk a little bit about prions and where they came from, and we can't do that without talking about a laboratory that existed back in the 60s, I believe, in the United States in Patuxent.
Yes, that's correct. You may remember that we had talked about Dr. Carlton Gajushek out in Papua New Guinea, and he had mailed a series of autopsied brains taken from dead people who had died of kuru, which is this brain wasting disease. Those brains were mailed to Bethesda, Maryland, and some of them ended up in Bethesda, Maryland. The others ended up at Fort Detrick in Maryland, which is coincidentally the center of always has been the center of biological research, warfare research in this country. Just down the road from Bethesda is a wildlife preserve called Patuxent. So beginning in the early 1960s, in 1963, a series of labs were converted in this wildlife refuge, and a very, very intense schedule of inoculation began using the brain material from the dead cannibals in New Guinea, as well as brain material obtained from CJD patients around the United States. These were injected into primates and dozens and dozens of species of animals in wildlife.
I would assume, Colm. Oh, I'm sorry. We're having a little bit of a. There's a little bit of a lag that just dipped in and out of the system, and I didn't realize you were still talking. But anyway, I'm assuming that the lab was stringently careful in controlling the movements and activities of these animals, and especially the mice, and making sure they didn't escape. Am I right?
Well, actually, that is not the case at all. The USDA, of all organizations, sent an inspector in 1963 to the facility at Patuxent, Maryland, which, as I mentioned, was in the middle of a wildlife refuge where wildlife passing through this whole area. This individual, Robert Reisinger from the USDA, actually was so appalled at the lax security in the facility, the potential for animals for escape was so large that he tried to shut the place down. He wrote letters to his superiors recommending that this place be shut down. Animals, chimpanzees are on the record as having escaped, but they were subsequently recaptured. The fact that at that time in the 1960s, little or nothing was known about how these prions actually jump from one species to another species. So this massive inoculation program that went on into dozens and dozens of animals and even birds was really a potential route of infection into multiple species in the area. And it is one of my theories in this book that I've written that this was a catalyst in this slow spread of these prion diseases through the wildlife population in the United States. And that obviously has implications in the year 2005 for many deer hunters, for example, as well as anybody who is in contact with wildlife. There is, parallel to the mad cow, potential mad cow epidemic in the United States, there is a major epidemic of the same disease in both elk and deer that is spreading like wildfire through the western states and also some of the eastern states in the United States. And it is, quite frankly, just out of control, especially in the last 5 years.
And there is on your website, on colmkellerher.com, a story, a very arresting story from January of 2005 about researchers in Canada being surprised to find prions in mice. And, of course, Patuxent was experimenting on mice, and mice were undoubtedly escaping. They certainly weren't recaptured like the chimpanzees. And one has to think that this was almost as bad as this horrible Lab 257 that we had a Dreamland about a couple of years ago, which was an absolutely a typhoid Mary, in this case, of prions being irresponsibly allowed to get into the wildlife population of this world, of this country. Now, let me go back to meats. I want to ask you, we talked a little bit about beef, but I know my listeners are sitting on the edges of their chair waiting to hear about other meats. What about pork? What about lamb? What about other meats?
We know in the case of lamb that there is a well-documented brain wasting disease in sheep and lambs called scrapie that has been around in the United States even longer, we think, than BSE. Now, it is an open question whether or not eating scrapie-infected lamb is dangerous or not. So far in the United Kingdom, there have been no documented cases of that because scrapie is epidemic in the United Kingdom, and it's also, strangely enough, epidemic in the United States. There is an unknown number of scrapie-infected sheep in the United States. It has not been definitively linked to the human brain-wasting diseases. However, that could be because nobody has looked hard enough. Now, you mentioned the other animals. There's a very interesting sort of history that has been going on with the attempts or the lack of attempts by the FDA to close some of the loopholes that supposedly were closed in 1997 when the USDA and the FDA decided to create what they call the firewall to make sure that the American public were, quote unquote, safe from these kinds of infections. But routinely, even in the year 2005, the ground-up remains of cattle are fed to chickens, and then chicken litter is fed back to cattle. Cattle blood is fed as a protein replacement to other cattle in the United States. So this is in spite of the statements that are routinely made by the USDA and the CDC that there is absolutely no possibility that ground-up cows are being fed to other cows in the United States. So some of these ground-up animals are also fed to pigs. Now, pigs, to our knowledge, do not carry or are not susceptible, are certainly not as susceptible as sheep and cows to these diseases. But it has been seen in very rare cases that pigs can come down with these brain wasting disease. But a lot of pigs are slaughtered before the sort of the long-term, slow creeping, direction of this brain disease happens. So they're slaughtered before these diseases can be manifest. So it's an open question about pork. No definitive evidence has come out. The so-called firewall that the authorities talk about, that the American beef is completely safe, it has actually so many loopholes, even in 2005, that it really cannot be considered a firewall.
Because what actually is happening is that all kinds of dead animals, including roadkill and just everything, end up in rendering plants. And they are rendered down into a variety of products as well as animal food, pet food, for example, your dog and cat. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what goes on in a rendering plant, Colm?
That is when the rendering plants have been under the radar for years, if not decades. They are the locations where as you mentioned, roadkill, dead animals, cows that die of unknown causes, are brought in, and they're stripped down. Every part of the animal is used for a variety of cosmetics, for leather in the case of cows. So no part of these dead animals are actually thrown out. Now,
so
there is
let me
a
ask
very,
you this.
very interesting.
Colm, just specifically, if someone is putting on some sort of chapstick or, chapped lip stuff or lipstick, could they be putting prions on their lips?
Well, that is one of the warnings that the FDA has released in the last 12 months in the United States, that there really needs to be a lot more care taken by the rendering industry and by the pharmaceutical industry for including beef products, exactly what you've just said, in shampoo, in chaps, anything like gelatin capsules, which are part and parcel of the pharmaceutical industry. There is always a potential for the spread of mad cow disease through this route. Now, the United Kingdom has been aware of this for many years, but it's just beginning to come up on the radar in the United States. But that is a great concern to the extent that the FDA did release a warning in the last 12 months.
What would you say to somebody who likes Jell-O?
Anything with ground up cow parts, including gelatin, which is really everywhere. It's in lipsticks. It's right across many of the cosmetics, and as you mentioned, in gelatin, jelly, Jell-O is up for grabs. I'm not trying to be overly alarmist, but this entire rendering industry has fed the byproducts of dead animals into dozens and dozens and dozens of human consumption, and the list goes on and on. Now, there was a very, very interesting study done, and it was done by the USDA in 2002, where they looked at a process called advanced meat recovery, which is part of this whole thing, where slaughterhouses try to maximize profits by taking meat from everywhere in the animal, and it's the use of hydraulic pressure for squeezing more meat from bones.
Yeah.
The USDA found in 2002 that meat from advanced meat recovery, which goes into the ground beef for frozen hamburgers, meatballs, pizza toppings, taco fillings, 35% of the ground beef from the AMR contained brain tissue. Now, that's almost 1/3 of the AMR samples that they looked at contained brain tissue. Now, brain is the central repository for these infectious prions. So, this was done in 2002. We're not talking about the 1960s or 1970s.
We've got to take a little break, Colm.
In 2002.
We will be right back with Colm Kellerher, his book, Brain Trust, The Hidden Connection Between Mad Cow and Misdiagnosed Alzheimer's Disease. And we're going in a surprising direction into the world of cattle mutilations in just a few minutes. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking to Colm Kellerher, his book, Brain Trust, The Hidden Connection Between Mad Cow and Misdiagnosed Alzheimer's Disease. His website, colmkellerher.com. Don't fail to visit it for the latest news. Colm, I was just going to bring up, in the book, there is an absolutely riveting chapter about the cattle mutilation phenomenon, which is of interest to me because it's been related to the UFO phenomenon, but also because I personally witnessed one of these cattle back oddly enough, in South Texas, and I was trying to think when I was reading your chapter when it must have been, probably around 1958, on a ranch. We, of course, didn't. It was far long before anyone had talked about this as any kind of a phenomenon or an odd problem, and the rancher's reaction was to cuss a blue streak, and he assumed that some local kids had come in and vandalized the animal. But it was exactly the same as the pictures I later, 20 years later, began to see of these things. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your studies in this area and where they led you?
Yes. We looked actually at a series of cattle mutilations, mostly in the western parts of the United States. And as you probably know, Whitley, there are definitely at least a couple of different MOs for cattle mutilations. In some cases, there's the classic removal of lips, tongues, eyes, and reproductive organs. And then in other cases, we came across a small number of cases that are completely different. Large parts of the animals are removed with sharp instruments. So I'm talking specifically about the former MO of cattle mutilations, which are a subset of the entire cattle mutilation phenomenon. But very briefly, because of the location of many of these cattle mutilations, we looked at in northeastern Colorado, there was a striking parallel, not only in Colorado but also in Canada, between the emergence of the first epidemic of prion disease in wildlife and the emergence of the cattle mutilation phenomenon in northeastern Colorado as well as Saskatchewan. Now, there was some very intriguing parallels between the types of tissues that were taken and the location of prion reservoirs in these animals. And I'm speaking specifically about the eye, about the tongue, about the reproductive organs. It is a known fact these days that if you were looking for prion locations in an animal, you would look in those particular locations. If you were sampling the spread of prions through, for example, the cattle population or the deer population, you would kill animals and you would sample those organs. So we decided to look at the overlap of cattle mutilations and the emergence of these prion diseases, and we chose a completely different location outside the United States to have a look at this. And it just happened that northwestern Saskatchewan has had a documented history of cattle mutilations. It has also a documented history of the emergence of that's where the BSE originated in Canada. It is also a center for chronic wasting disease in both deer and in elk in Canada. And thirdly, it is the center of scrapie. It is a center of scrapie infection in Canada. So you have a small area in northwestern Saskatchewan that has an epicenter of cattle mutilations. It has an epicenter of chronic wasting disease in deer. It is the origin of BSE and is also one of the origins of scrapie. So you've got the emergence of 3 different prion diseases overlaid on a map where there is a high concentration of cattle mutilation. So we found that those parallels very, very compelling. And we put out the hypothesis in the book, and I emphasize it as strictly a hypothesis, that at least a subset of these cattle mutilations are in fact a monitoring, or it's a monitoring program for the spread of the infectious organisms. Now, one obvious question is why not just go to the slaughterhouses and collect samples? The answer to that is you will never get the kinds of data in North America from slaughterhouses that you could get from sampling in the wild, so to speak. It is a classic spread of wildlife kind of disease monitoring operation that is routinely done for anthrax in wild animals, that kind of thing.
Do you find any signatures of anything like, for example, anesthetics used in these animals?
Yes, some of the chemical analysis that was done on some of the tissues by the NIDS organization that you mentioned yielded exactly that. There was evidence of sedatives. Oxandole is in high concentrations is a well-known sedative, especially in use in Europe. There are other sedative-like compounds have been found, and we're talking about high-resolution gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis of the eye fluids of these animals. So there was a very, very interesting parallel study done in outside the United States too, which was very intriguing to me, and that was in Argentina in 2002. There was, in the summer of 2002, there was the documented emergence of a literal epidemic of cattle mutilations in Argentina in 2002. It is very, very interesting that at the same time, Argentina was covertly battling an epidemic, not of prion disease, but of foot and mouth disease. And foot and mouth disease is equally devastating to the economy as prion disease. So, part of the hypothesis is that the monitors, so to speak, are monitoring the spread of infectious disease covertly through cattle populations. Not only prion disease, but other infectious diseases that could be equally devastating to the economies of a country.
Let me ask you this. Is there any progress being made on a cure for prion-generated disease?
At this time, there are a huge number of companies that are involved, and academic research labs that are involved in trying to generate various, not only antibody and immunological methods for cures as well, not to mention small molecules. None have been successful to date. In other words, these diseases are still 100% lethal. There has not been a documented case of recovery from these diseases once they have been diagnosed. Now, obviously, once the disease is diagnosed, the disease has basically shot most of the brain. The brain looks like Swiss cheese. There's the accumulation of plaques in the brain. So by the time a person starts, exhibiting initial symptoms like forgetfulness, mood swings, sudden outbursts of anger, confusion, insomnia, eyesight problems, and then muscles start twitching, tremors start, and then the entire body starts going into convulsions. By the time those symptoms start, the disease has already ravaged the brain to a state where it is not possible to recover. So, really, what is needed in the United States is, number one, a very, very big increase in the amount of testing that is going on for these CJD, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, so that if these diseases were made mandatory reportable and autopsies were conducted on these people, then we would get a handle of how far this disease is spreading through humans in the United States. Right now, we simply don't know. The counterpart to that in the United States is that the level of testing of cows for mad cow disease is pitifully low.
Pitifully, and is going to stay low because the Cattlemen's Association / U.S. Department of Agriculture is going to keep it low.
Correct. And you know, if you look at the numbers, there are 35 million cattle slaughtered every year that end up on the dinner table in the United States. Out of those 35 million, only 200,000 animals, and that is only because of the extreme pressure brought to bear as a result of the mad cow case that was officially admitted to in Washington State in December 2003. That number prior to the mad cow case, that number was only 20,000 animals per year out of 35 million were tested. Now it is 200,000 per year, but we're still talking less than 1% of the animals that end up on the dinner table in the United States are tested for mad cow disease. You compare this to Japan, every single animal that ends up on the dinner table in Japan is tested prior
and
for mad cow disease, so 100%
are tested.
In Europe, that figure is 35%. So in the United States, less than 1% of these cows are being tested. So, you know, the obvious conclusion from this is that the USDA does not have a very large interest in testing these cows.
And on that somber note, we are going to have to bring our interview with Dr. Colm Kellerher to an end. His must-read book, Brain Trust, The Hidden Connection Between Mad Cow and Misdiagnosed Alzheimer's Disease. His website, colmkellerher.com. Don't miss it. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. Linda Moulton Howe up next. You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science discovery and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets and the facts that others dare not. Earthfiles.com. This week she's reporting on prion disease. Listen carefully. This is important to your own welfare. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. Well, this week on April 2nd of 2005, a second case of chronic wasting disease was confirmed in a white-tailed deer farm in Oneida County, New York State. Utica is the county seat. The week before, the first case was reported by New York's Department of Agriculture and Markets and the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. Chronic wasting disease, also known as CWD, is similar to mad cow in its ability to transmit from animal to animal. But so far, CWD has only been found in white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, and moose in North America. Mad cow, also known as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE, has infected cattle and people in England and many other European countries since the early 1990s. More than 200 people have died from a mad cow-related disease in Europe after eating infected meat and organs. Since both chronic wasting disease and mad cow cause severe brain and nervous system deterioration, which is always fatal, scientists have been trying to understand how mad cow crosses the species barrier from animals to people. So far, CWD has never had a confirmed link to human illness and death. Both diseases are caused by natural body proteins called prions that become misshapen or folded the wrong way. So far, no one knows why the naturally occurring proteins in animals and humans go haywire and cause so much self-destruction in the brain and nervous system. The United States and Canada have been working hard to keep mad cow-infected cattle out of the Northern Hemisphere, but there have been a few cases in the past couple of years. And while chronic wasting disease was originally a problem only in western deer, elk, and moose, the prion disease has now spread to 13 states from the Rocky Mountains to New York and into the Canadian provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta. In New York State, deer are raised in captive herds called deer farms to sell the meat for venison steaks or to ship out to game hunting preserves. The bottom line is that all the captive herds will eventually be eaten. What New York State is faced with right now are 7 deer herds in the same region, which now must be taken out of circulation. Of the 7, 2 herds have had the CWD-infected deer. All 20 animals in those 2 herds were killed this week, so their brains can be studied at New York's Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory at Cornell University. Microscopic examination of brain, lymph, tonsil, and nervous tissue is the only way to confirm the presence of the destructive proteins. This week, I talked with Michael Fraser, Assistant Commissioner for Media Relations in New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation in Albany. I asked him if they had any idea how the 2 Oneida County deer herds became infected with CWD.
There's a lot we need to learn about CWD. We know the effects. We know it's always fatal. As far as transmission of from animal to animal, we're still in the learning process. And because of that, because there are questions that need to be answered, we implemented stringent regulations as a precautionary measure to try to keep CWD away from New York. We've learned from the states that have faced this challenge in the Midwest, and it's fair to say that we are continuing to learn more about CWD as time goes on, and continue to try to get more answers.
What's the current thinking about where the source of the prion disease came from in these 2 deer?
That's a matter that we're looking into, and that's the most important part of our investigation right now. There are a number of theories, but to speculate on one or to narrow down one, it's a little premature. We're working, the DEC is working with the Department of Agriculture and Markets to identify the source, because we're dealing with captive herds. We're backtracking and trying to dig up as much as we can on the history of any transactions, the history of any importation of these animals in New York, and doing whatever we can to make that final determination, or to put that piece of the puzzle in place.
Do you know where the captive herds came from?
Right now, there's that we haven't made a final determination on that yet. It's certainly it varies from animal to animal. Some are born on the farm. Others come from different parts of the state. But we're trying to track all that down, and it's the highest priority for us is to gain more knowledge and to get a better handle on what the source is.
So the DEC and others might not really even have paperwork or a paper trail on each animal in a captive herd?
There's the potential for that. That if some owners of some farms may, as with anything, keep more diligent records than others. Mm-hmm. But that's that's something Ag Markets and DEC are going to work together on and do what we can to gain as much knowledge through record keeping, through interviews, through various means to backtrack and do as thorough and comprehensive as much research as we can on this.
What is happening right now to these 7 herds, the 2 in which you have found the confirmed chronic wasting disease, and the other 5?
At the 2 farms where we've detected CWD, we're conducting the depopulation, meaning we're going to take the deer and sample all of the deer at our Cornell laboratories.
Which means you have to kill them first.
Right. As you know, to take a sample to test for CWD, you need matter. You need brain matter.
Right. And how do you go about doing this, and how many animals will be killed?
All the animals in the 2 herds, so you're talking a total of 20, will be killed and sampled.
When will this occur? When will the animals be killed and be shipped to Cornell?
They'll be killed today and shipped immediately to Cornell. We hope to have test results back from those herds within
like around the 18th of April?
That's about right.
And the goal right now is in studying the 20 animals, which would be the entire population of the two herds, is to see how many more might be infected?
Correct.
Now, what about the other 5 herds?
Right now, for DEC's perspective, what we're going to do is implement regulations and additional restrictions on the movement of deer in this immediate area.
Does that mean you're going to stop any transportation of all of these deer in these 7 herds until you find out?
Correct.
If you've got captive herds with chronic wasting disease, how many of the wild deer population outside the fence could also have it?
That's certainly a concern for DEC, and that's why we're going to conduct an extensive monitoring program around these farms to make that determination. We have, when CWD was detected in Wisconsin, we began a sampling program around the state. We sampled nearly 3,500 deer for CWD, including 40 in Oneida County, and have not come back with a positive result. Mm-hmm. We're going to continue that and intensify our efforts in this area to determine whether or not that CWD has spread to the wild herd.
And if it has, what do you do?
That's a good question. We'll continue monitoring. We'll try to implement measures and continue our investigations to a source. Try to determine if there are other affected regions in New York. But that's certainly something we're hoping we don't have to get to.
Because then you would have to put out an advisory throughout the state of New York telling hunters and restaurants and everyone it is no longer safe in the unknown. It is no longer safe to consume deer and elk?
No, I don't think that's something we would do. I think we would advise people, and we recommend to people right now, and this would come from the Department of Health, not from DEC, to not eat a deer or elk that tests positive for CWD. Our greatest concern would be finding that this has spread and gotten into the wild deer population. Obviously, the ramifications for that would be felt and would be considerable.
Meaning economic.
Right.
People would not feel comfortable hunting, and there might have to be a restriction on venison and that sort of consumption.
Well, I don't want to speculate on that, but there certainly is that potential, and it's why why we've been aggressive in our regulation thus far, and why our response to this will be equally as aggressive. We've seen what's happened in other states, and the effects that it's had out there on sportsmen's groups, on hunting, on venison donation, and obviously from an economic standpoint, it would certainly it's certainly not what we want to see for our sportsmen and for industries that rely on this. They rely on a healthy deer population. To attract tourism, to bring people into the outdoors and such. So from our standpoint, that's our primary concern, is to contain as much as we can, and to first determine if this has gotten into the wild population, and to do whatever we can, to meet the challenge and to mitigate the problem. And to be honest, I don't think when we saw it only as far east as Illinois, I think. The thinking was that we may, if it is spreading, it's going to take a little time, but here we are, and so now it's unfortunately facing the inevitable, maybe a lot sooner than we thought we'd have to. Right,
it has happened very quickly.
Yeah,
and that in and of itself has got to be a major concern.
Yeah, and it's not just for us. I mean, we've got, as you can imagine, our neighbors.
Yeah.
Got their attention as well.
Well, all the other states,
yeah.
That's in everybody's mind,
yeah.
could end up with chronic wasting disease.
Yeah.
And then what happens?
Right.
Chronic wasting disease and mad cow are not the only fatal diseases in which prion proteins change shape and destroy the brain and nervous system. Ranchers have long had to cope with scrapie in sheep, but there is no known case in which the scrapie-causing prion protein has been transmitted to humans. But people are susceptible to several prion diseases, which include Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and its mad cow variant, which is transmissible from cattle to humans, Kuru, contracted during a Pacific Island native tradition to eat the brains of the dead families, and Alpers syndrome. Many scientists are working on the prion problem, and this week I talked with one expert about research into the differences between the misshapen proteins in CWD, mad cow, and other prion diseases. He is Dr. Srinand Srivadasan, Associate Professor of Veterinary Population Medicine in the University of Minnesota, St. Paul. He begins with what's happening at the protein level in an analogy with a sheet of paper.
And you nicely fold it into a rocket or an airplane form. And you take another exact same type piece of paper and you just crumple it and toss both across the room. One goes gliding through the room and the other goes and plops down somewhere. The normally folded protein would serve a function, and it would be like the airplane that was folded out of this paper, and the crumpled paper would be the abnormally folded form. It doesn't serve a function, but it does do something else because it has a tendency to aggregate, and it has a tendency to destroy cells.
And the mystery is what causes the molecules to go haywire in the first place,
right,
and cause the crumpled paper instead of the nice airplane.
Right.
When you look and study the protein folds that are responsible for chronic wasting disease, and you compare those to the protein folding that's responsible for mad cow disease, do the proteins look about the same, or are there substantial differences?
See, the problem is that we've not really crystallized the protein. Nobody, I believe, has so far of chronic wasting disease versus that of BSE. They're working on it. Well, the protein amino acid sequences are a little different between bovine and the deer population. The normal amino acid sequence does vary, and when you look at it on a phylogenetic tree, although the ruminant prion proteins cluster together, they are separated by a small percent of variation in the amino acid sequences. And the basic primary amino acid sequences, which are the building blocks of a protein, would determine how the protein would fold, because they would determine the acidity, the basicity, and so on of different parts of the protein. Regardless, the prion protein, if we understood the function of it, and if we knew what a particular conformation or a folded pattern would indicate in terms of function, then we'd be able to tell if there are major variations in the abnormally folded bovine spongiform encephalopathy-associated prion and the CWD prion. To directly answer that question, I don't think we know enough to actually say that, just because this is not folded in this particular fashion doesn't mean that it's not going to transmit to humans.
Mm-hmm.
Or it means that we are now safe and we can go ahead and eat any types of meat we want.
That we cannot say that.
No, we cannot, because we don't know sufficient amounts of information about the protein folding characteristics to actually make that call. If we did, then we would probably be making recommendations about how safe CWD was or not.
Right, and that's why when two white-tailed deer that are basically grown for people to eat are found in two different herds with a positive chronic wasting disease prion, it has to raise red flags for everybody in New York and the states where they're found about eating game that they kill, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like they say, better safe than sorry. And I think in infectious disease we've learned lessons that you can't ignore an infectious agent and say it doesn't exist because we haven't found it. One thing to remember is while the transmission of the disease within the same species is easy, the transmission across species barriers is difficult. And this is very important that we keep track of where the animals are moving between states or between countries globally. Mm-hmm. Sure, that we have now found 2 new cases in New York State, but we don't know if it is actually spreading. We know that we are identifying more and more cases as we test more and more animals.
Mm-hmm. I see your point.
Yeah. So we don't know if it's a diagnostic suspicion bias, where just because we went and tested them, we found them, mm-hmm. or if it actually spread and this particular same strain of the prion or the same conformation of the prion is spreading across the animal populations.
But if I understand what you said earlier, you would be reluctant to eat venison that had a positive diagnosis of CWD?
Yeah, if it was a positive animal, I wouldn't eat it.
Right.
Yep. If in the infectious form, we hope that the species barriers will protect us. But the recent history of BSE suggests that it has not.
Right. There's been a lot of deaths in Europe.
Yes. Yep. I think it's now almost 200-something.
Right. Yeah. And if it's happening in Europe, it could happen here.
Yes, it could. I can't say no to that question, but yeah, it could.
In normal health, if prion proteins fold the wrong way in animals or humans, the mistakes will be soluble and be flushed out of the body systems. But in prion disease, for unknown reasons, the misshapen protein is no longer soluble. It's thought to be in a non-soluble crystallized form. The goal of prion researchers now is to isolate the misshapen protein crystals if possible for study. If it can be understood how the proteins fold themselves the wrong way, then maybe scientists can find an antidote that could return prion proteins to their normal shape and restore health to the infected animals and humans. And Whitley, let's hope this happens sooner than later, because this self-destructive prion protein in animals and humans is really terrible and fatal.
Linda Moulton Howe, thank you very much for our provocative report. Next week on Dreamland and Mysterious Powers, one of our most popular guests, Stephen Sora, he's going to be talking on Dreamland about who really discovered America and some of the secrets of the Templars that have not yet been explored. First to feature Dave Louthan, by the way, who is an important whistleblower in this industry. Dave was pointing out that a cow that he had slaughtered that had proved positive for BSE, bovine spongiform encephalitis, was not what the agriculture department was claiming, a downer cow, that this animal was not downer, and that he had suspicions about its condition, which is why he had the brain matter tested. Dave subsequently lost his job, and we will be talking also about the unhealthy and unholy connection between the cattleman's industry, the ranching industry, and the Department of Agriculture, both here and in the United Kingdom, that has almost certainly led to the spread of this disease. In any case, let's go back and let's find out first, what is this disease and where does it come from exactly?
It is a truly unique disease biochemically and medically. It really came to the forefront of attention in a very obscure place in Papua New Guinea in the 1950s, when a medical researcher named Dr. Carlton Gajushek began investigating this tribe called the Foray tribe that were dying in their hundreds and actually eventually in their thousands from this unknown brain wasting disease that took them over. They began initially with symptoms of forgetfulness, and then tremors began, and then their entire bodies basically broke down. Dr. Gajushek was a very well-connected researcher, and he began autopsying these unfortunate tribespeople, sending their brains back to Washington, D.C., where it was discovered that the brains were actually shot full of holes like Swiss cheese. Plaques had started forming in the brains. And to make a long story short, it turned out that this disease, this terrible disease, was spread by means of cannibalism. The Foray tribe had the custom of eating their dead relatives, and many of these relatives had died of what the Foray called kuru, but actually,
who of course was the man who shot Lee Harvey Oswald and prevented him from telling whatever he knew about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. In the summer of 1966, Jack Ruby was granted a new trial. Appellate judges said that he had there had been just too much publicity and in Dallas, and that he was granted a new trial. They were going to move it to Wichita Falls, Texas. But before that could happen, he was given a physical by the Dallas jail doctor and pronounced fit, okay, by the end of the summer of 1966. But then by Thanksgiving of 1966, they said he had entered Parkland Hospital with the flu. A few days later, they said, no, it wasn't the flu, it was lung cancer. And within 2 months, he was dead. Now, this is galloping cancer, and this is not very usual. And I think that it points us in the direction of purposeful death.
Yes.
By injecting cancer.
Well, Congressman Schiff died of a relatively harmless form of cancer, skin cancer, that became extremely virulent in his case and perplexed and terrified doctors and ultimately took his life. Bill Mallow was given a physical and pronounced completely fine just a couple of weeks before he ended up with 2 different forms of leukemia.
That's pretty amazing. And let's look at what Congressman Schiff was involved in at the time that he suddenly got this terrible cancer. He was involved in a congressional investigation through the General Accounting Office of the Roswell crash of 1947. And although he was not able to get to any damning information, he nevertheless, in the GAO, reported that all of the message traffic between Roswell Army Airfield between the years of about 1946 to about 1949 were all missing, which should tell any thinking person that they had something to hide there, and it certainly must have gone far beyond just one of their mogul balloons. The argument, and they even made this argument on the Peter Jennings special, which was that Roswell was nothing unearthly. It was just a mogul balloon, and yet and they brought out Carl Flock
about the very latest discoveries as this terrible disease, mad cow disease, spreads across the United States under the media's radar, but not under our radar. You listen up carefully because you need this information very badly. Before we go to that, I've got Jim Marrs with me. Jim Marrs is going to be joining us on Dreamland on a regular basis. He's going to be a co-host like William Henry, specializing in conspiracies like William specializes in the lost past. It's going to be very exciting to have Jim with us on a regular basis. Jim is going to be talking today about Peter Jennings. Jim, tell us a little bit about what you've been thinking.
Hey, Whitley, it's always good to be with you. I'm wondering if we need to add Peter Jennings to the long list of UFO investigators who have all seemed to pass away due to cancer.
We have Don Ledger, we have Kenny Young, we have Bill Mallow, we have Jim Fueling, we have Congressman Stephen Schiff. All died of cancers, many of them quite unusual, like Bill Mallow's and Steve Schiff's. And now we have this tragic news right after he announces on the Larry King show that he believes there's something in the UFO issue. He is diagnosed with lung cancer.
Exactly. And, of course, even in the 2-hour special, Seeing is Believing, that ABC aired, and I'm sure he was very much constrained in what he could say. But yet, even in that special, we heard him ended up by saying this is one of the most fascinating investigations he had ever undertaken. So I think he was obviously impressed with the information that he was finding from his researchers in regard to the UFO issue.
Jim, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you know about cancer-inducing drugs as an assassination tool?
There is evidence to show that elements within the intelligence community of the federal government have been working very actively since the 50s, probably trying to see if they could come up with a cancer-causing agent. And I'm going to have some information that I'll present to the listeners on Dreamland that shows they may have been very successful with this. And if that's the case, then we have to go back and look at prominent people and people that were very in the forefront of some of the most sensitive investigations in this country who just suddenly die from cancer. I give you one good example is the nightclub owner, Jack Ruby.
Director of the National Institute for Discovery Scientists, Dr. Kellerher has written an incredibly important book called Brain Trust, The Hidden Connection Between Mad Cow and Misdiagnosed Alzheimer's Disease. I will start off this interview with a simple statistic from his book. In 1979, 635 people died from Alzheimer's disease in the United States of America. In 2002, 58,000 people died from this disease in the United States of America. This has been dismissed as simply changes in reporting methods and so on and so forth. Well, I don't think Dr. Kellerher would agree with that, would you, Colm?
No, I would definitely not agree. I would agree that there's a component of the expansion of the definition of what Alzheimer's really is between 1979 and here, but here we have a 9,000% increase in the numbers of deaths from Alzheimer's disease. And what really struck me a couple of years ago was a study by a group of people at Yale University and another from the University of Pittsburgh, where they went into the autopsied brains of Alzheimer's disease patients and showed that those patients had not died from Alzheimer's disease, but had died from a brain wasting disease that is linked with mad cow disease. And that was so hidden in the statistic of the 4 to 5 million people in this country with Alzheimer's is a group, a subset of unknown proportions that are dying from the human equivalent of mad cow disease. And that really was the impetus. It was both the increase in Alzheimer's disease as well as this hidden fraction dying from this strange disease that really caught my attention and prompted me to start writing this book.
Okay, now let's sort of go back to the beginning of the story. First, it's a fascinating and terrible story. And one, by the way, folks, you need to listen to this closely. Don't tune this out. This program was among the very
as their expert, never mentioning that Carl Flock was former CIA and was also an assistant Secretary of Defense. So, obviously he has a vested interest in how he presents the Roswell story. But nevertheless, in his book, when he gives us the details of this classified mogul project, there were about 22 mogul balloon launches, and they only recovered less than 10 of them.
Yes.
And the reason they only recovered less than 10 is the simple fact, as Carl Flock reports, that they did not bother to go look for them. Now, that doesn't sound like much of a secret program to me.
No. Well, in my bottom line on Roswell is always very simple. My uncle, Colonel Edward Strieber, told me to my face that he had personally participated in the attempt to reassemble the debris from Roswell that had been brought to Wright Field. His commanding officer, General Arthur Exon, said to me, and I quote, everyone from the White House on down knew that it was not of this world within 24 hours of our finding it. So
that's true. In fact, looking at the Roswell case, on balance, we find that on the one hand, if you want to trust the government, which has changed its story 4 times, then nothing much happened, although there's little or nothing to support that pronouncement.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there are now, as I counted, more than 400 individuals on the public record who have said, well, I was there, and gave stories similar to General Exum.
Jim, thank you very much. And, I've had my differences with Peter Jennings, but folks, do pray for him. This is an awful thing that has happened to this man. And whether it is something induced or just an unfortunate accident of nature, we probably will never know. In any case, stay tuned, because we're going to go looking into prion disease, and you really need to hear this. Both Colm Kellerher and then later Linda have got a lot to say about it. You need to understand this, and you need to understand it right now. Subscribers, this is to let you know that you can get $1 off on Brain Trust. There is a coupon available for you in the subscriber section. It is Brain Sub, that is BRAINSUB. If you input that as you check out of the unknowncountry.com store, you will get a nice $1 off on your purchase of Brain Trust. I'm honored to have with me today Colm Kellerher, former